a couple of words about my background, since it's perhaps somewhat specific, and then we will kick off. So when it comes to the background, as I said, actually, the beginning of my research around 10 years ago was in philosophy of perception, and I approached certain issues from the philosophy of perception from the standpoint of formal ontology and more or less traditional analytic epistemology, which is, let's say, my training. This is the way in which I was trained or brought up as a philosopher in Krakow. And so I wanted to approach specific topics, especially so-called aspectual shape of perception from the ontological perspective. And then, as part of this job, I came across embodied cognition and enactivism and this sort of stuff, and I got really, really interested in it, especially in Varela and his legacy, although not so much in all these sectarian debates within the movement. And eventually I ended up trying to provide something I like to call ontological foundations of embodied cognition, especially in activism. What kind of ontology of cognition these people bring to the table. And I have spent like a couple of years, let's say, trying to provide this kind of thing in various papers of mine and in the book, which has just been finished, and it's not published, but I hope it will be. And the title of the book is The Footprint. The main title of the book is The Footprint of Mind. So you can tell me whether or not you like the title in the Q&A, The Footprint of Mind, and this is the final result. So, and from that point on, you can go either to the minimal or to the maximal, as I put it here. So going to the minimal means engaging in certain stuff in the philosophy of biology, like minimal cognition, cognitive evolution, and these things. And I try to do certain things in this area, although not that much. Or you can go to the maximal, and by that I mean investigating more and more complex phenomena, like social phenomena, like institutions, and especially what I'm interested in is the relationship between institutional backgrounds and economic growth, and what kind of impact this change in our ontology of cognition can have when it comes to our understanding of social phenomena, especially institutions. And this is actually my topic. This is actually the thing that I'm trying to investigate right now. I'm at the very beginning of investigating these things. That's why I'm kind of afraid that I won't have much to say about the things that you are interested in, but Sebastian was optimistic enough to invite me here, so I'm here, and we'll see. Okay, to the point. My plan for today is that first I will say something quite trivial, you're all familiar with that, about boundaries and life, and why boundaries. Well, first of all, the formal ontological thing that I was trying to do, let's say, in the foundations of enactivism, had to do with boundaries and places. It's usually called locative ontology, or it's a terrible term, but I will use it, mereotopology. It's a combination of mathematical topology and formal ontology having to do with, or dealing with boundaries and bounded locations. So that's why I decided to say something about boundaries today. So first I want to say something about boundaries and life, then about certain ontological peculiarities of boundaries, and then I will come up with my own, or at least just a sketch of my own proposal when it comes to what kinds of boundaries we can distinguish, because the standard distinction between real and just conventional boundaries is not that appealing. At least I hope that it won't be that appealing after I will present these peculiarities. And then back to life, so to speak, meaning what kind of takeaways we can have when it comes to the topics that you are interested in, which is the nature of life. Okay, so boundaries are quite critical when it comes to our understanding of what a living creature is, and it's, I guess, quite intuitive. So we can refer to the classics like Maturana, although still not very mainstream, but certainly one of the classics. Or we can, and he says in his approach, in his description of the autopoietic system, he says that the system is a concrete unity in space in which the system exists by specifying the topological domain of its realization, which means basically bounded locations. And if we want to refer to a more mainstream position, we can refer to Koshland Jr., who is the former chief editor of Nature or Science, one of these two major journals, I forgot which one. And he came up with what he calls the pillars of life. And the third pillar of life is what he refers to as you can see it. So basically it means distinctions, drawing distinctions. So he refers to surfaces, which is basically just another term for boundaries. Surfaces are specific kinds of boundaries. So it is critical in his approach that living creatures maintain, not just have, but maintain boundaries. And when it comes to some famous philosophers of biology, we can refer to Godfrey Smith, for example, and he says that a living creature is a bounded self-producing unit, and it needs to have boundaries to prevent movements towards thermodynamic equilibrium, of course. We can also refer to Villalobos and Rosetta Bari from the enactivist tradition. They say that a living system is endowed with an identifiable boundary that separates it from its surroundings. So being bounded is critical for a living creature if it is supposed to be a living creature. And I guess that it's not a very controversial claim. Okay. Now, when it comes to the ontology of boundaries, the first thing likely in the literature that we come across is this distinction made by Barry Smith, who's, let's say, one of the most important authors in this terrible area called mereotopology. Actually, he proposed the term mereotopology, so he's responsible for that. And he comes up with a quite intuitive distinction between fiat and bona fide boundaries. And it's quite intuitive in the sense that there is something solid when it comes to the boundary between a mountain, like the mountain on the picture, and, say, the air surrounding the mountain. So this boundary is really solid. It is there in nature, and we can hardly doubt about it. Whereas, for example, the boundary, or a boundary, or many different boundaries between this very mountain and the area around it, a valley of some sort or something like that, is more fuzzy, blurred, perhaps conventional. It depends on who draws this boundary and what are the needs projecting or designing these conventional boundaries. Okay, so that's fine. It's quite intuitive. However, it's not very useful, as you will hopefully see in a moment. So, as I said, I would like to refer to certain ontological peculiarities of boundaries, and then we can start from the boundaries of organisms. So when it comes to the boundaries of organisms, we read, for example, in a nice paper by Fred Kaiser and Arnelos, that it's once again quite obvious, you might say, that animals have an internal gut in some form or other, where food items are digested inside the body but outside of the cells. This means that the boundaries of the living body, of me as a living body, are not identical to let's say, the total sum of all the boundaries of the cells composing my body. There is something different. There is something special about the boundaries of me as a living body. They are not reducible to these, how would you put it, properly physical barriers, okay? And the things become even more interesting, much more interesting, when we realize, and Godfrey Smith points it out, that he says explicitly that multicellular organisms have vague boundaries with respect to which cells are parts of the organism and which are not. And the best example most likely comes from the phenomenon of symbiosis. We need certain environmentally acquired bacteria as parts of our digestive tract. It's quite obvious. So they are not parts of our bodies in one sense, but on the other hand, they are critical. We cannot survive without them. Our digestion depends on them, so that's why, in some other sense, they are parts of our body. They are parts of me as a living body. So where is the boundary of me as a living body once again? And Thomas Prodor, for example, comes up with this idea of immunological criteria. Something is part of my body if it is, or it can be, it may not be, but it can be part of my body if it is tolerated by my immune system, which suggests that we can perhaps speak of, I don't want to make too strong a claim, but perhaps we could speak of immunological boundaries in addition to our physical barriers. So it's quite interesting. So let's suppose, just for the sake of this argument, that we can really think of immunological boundaries and perhaps many other kinds of boundaries that differ from our physical barriers. So, but let us realize that the distinction between the fiat and the bona fide is not clear here. I mean, the application of this distinction is not clear, because on the one hand, the boundaries, the immunological boundaries, for example, are critical, and they are certainly real, but they are not that bona fide as Barry Smith imagined, I guess. So there is a problem here. How are we supposed to categorize these immunological boundaries when it comes to this fiat versus bona fide distinction? It's not that clear, at least to me. Perhaps it's clear to you. You can express your optimism when it comes to this distinction in the Q&A. Okay. Now, when it comes to other kinds of objects, first let's start from organisms, but approached as objects, let's say, material objects that we can observe. So, the question is, what actually counts as an object? And this is especially problematic a question from the perspective of those people who work in who investigate non-visual, who investigate mechanisms of non-visual perception. And here, for example, Michael Kubowy and I forgot the first name, and Falkenburg, they are known for their studies in auditory perception, and they actually realized at some point and articulated this realization that language itself suggests that objects are visible by definition, but of course, why? It should not be that way. So what they mean is more or less, at least in my understanding, is more or less this. So imagine a scene in which we have our friend Kazimierz. I got enough of people like Smith and Jones, so let's use some good Slavic, Polish in this case, name. We have Kazimierz, and our friend, and he hears a bird. And here we have a picture of professional bird listeners, and you know what is the right term in English. actually people investigating the sounds made by birds. So we have the scene, Kazimierz hears a bird, and now usually we imagine a visual bird, so to speak, and this visual bird, the bird that I can see, produces some sound. However, we might ask, what boundaries does this bird have, not qua seen plus heard, when I see a bird and then I attribute a given sound to that bird, and not qua seen by an external observer as the picture depicts, but the bird just qua heard. And Kubov and Falkenburg, they come up with the notion of auditory object. And auditory objects do have boundaries, but we can hardly imagine, but at least we can think of the fact, realize the fact that the boundaries of these auditory objects are different from the boundaries of visual objects. And there is no reason to prioritize visual objects over auditory objects, because why? Ontologically speaking, it's perfectly fine. We have an auditory object, and the only reason why we prioritize visual objects in our ontology is that we are, so to speak, visual or vision-centric creatures, and that's it. That's the only reason. Okay, but let's continue. In a very similar spirit, we have Achille Varzi, who is one of the most important former ontologists these days. He's an Italian philosopher from Columbia University, so functionally he's an American philosopher, and he's quite explicit in this respect. Namely, he says that the boundaries that strike us as natural are likely to reflect, for the most part, our cognitive limitations. And, for example, an apple. Physically speaking, however, he says, we all know that an apple is not the solid, continuous substance that it seems to be. It is a smudgy crowd of tiny particles frantically dancing in empty space. Very poetic, but we can feel what he wants to say. And this naive realism with respect to particles is just for the sake of this argument. We don't have to be naively physicalistic. But just for the sake of the argument, we can assume that there are these little particles dancing in space, and what we perceive as chairs and tables are basically clouds of particles. And now, how do we draw the boundaries between these clouds? There is nothing bona fide about it, at least according to Varzi, who has nothing to do with embodied cognition, Varela, and all these traditions that we are perhaps more familiar with. But he comes up with this statement, actually undermining the bona fide versus fiat distinction, because all the boundaries that we can experience are fiat in this approach. And we have Varela, Thompson, and Roche coming up with a very, very similar claim. They write that they ask first, what counts as a surface? How do we specify its edges, boundaries, texture, and orientation, if not in relation to some perceiver to whom the distinctions are relevant? You can see that it's in a very, it's actually in the same spirit, from two different standpoints in philosophy. Okay, now perhaps you can recognize the scene here. So let's speak of conventional or situational or social boundaries. So let's imagine a street fight. You can say that the boundaries produced by certain social interactions are conventional, but does it mean that they are not real? If you imagine some people attacking you on the street, suddenly you find yourself in a certain confinement produced by this situation. It is not that easy, at least if you are not Bruce Lee, to break this newly emerged boundary and to resituate yourself. So you find yourself confined, and it may have real consequences for you, despite the fact that it's conventional, you might say. There's nothing bona fide about this boundary. However, it's real if the term real is supposed to mean anything. Okay? So once again, this distinction turns out to be not that appealing as it seemed. Okay, so my diagnosis is that the bona fide versus fiat distinction is not very useful, let's say. It's intuitive and it's perfectly fine to use it in our everyday life and in many different contexts, but philosophically speaking, ontologically speaking, it may not be that useful. Yeah, and now what are we supposed to do with it? So my claim is that this distinction is grounded on what I would call the idea or the concept of a detached subject. And what I mean by that comes from Varela once again. Varela, Thompson, Roche, they write that the traditional wisdom, as they refer to, says that the environment in which organisms evolve is fixed and unique, and organisms are basically parachuted into this pre-given environment. So if we have this idea of a pre-given environment and certain boundaries in it, we are faced with a choice. Either there are certain bona fide boundaries in this pre-given environment, or every single boundary that we come across, perceive, or can think of, or whatever, all these boundaries are just, how would you put it, superficial, they are just epiphenomenal, or, you know. So if we have this notion of a pre-given environment, and we expect to find some bona fide boundaries there, and then we realize that these bona fide boundaries existing there are not that bona fide, then the only conclusion that we can draw is that they are all fiat, which is not very informative, because there are crucial distinctions between these so-called fiat boundaries. Some of them may be less consequential, some of them may be more consequential, less critical, more critical. So, as I said, this distinction becomes not that much informative when it comes to our, let's say, going to the core reflection, which means philosophical reflection. And the source, the real source of this situation is this idea of the parachuting subject, as we can call it, referring to Varela. Okay, so now what are we supposed to do with it, and whether there are any alternatives? So when it comes to possible alternatives, the first thing that we should do is to realize that it is not necessary for complex entities to have boundaries. Perhaps we can think of, not necessarily imagine, but at least think of a world without any boundaries, in which everything is mixed with everything else, and that's basically it. It's not our world for sure, but it's a thinkable, well, okay, it's a risky statement, but at least for God, it's a thinkable universe. Okay, let's keep this question. But you're right. So I would quote Descartes, and I would say that at least it is possible for God to create a universe without any boundaries, because he said that when it comes to souls and bodies, that at least God could have created souls or minds without bodies, which does not mean that our minds are without bodies. So this is very, but never mind. It's about Cartesian dualism, which is not that dualistic as it usually is portrayed. It's a model dualism. At least for God, it could be possible. It's not dualism saying that we are souls detached from bodies, but it's a different topic. So at least for God, it should be possible to create a world without any boundaries. So if there are boundaries, then the question is, what roles do they play? And in this context, oh my God, not much time left. In this context, we can once again refer to Godfrey Smith and his description of the shortly Precambrian era in the evolution of cognition in particular. And he says that whereas we are as animals very much aware of what is going on in our environments, we are constantly interacting with our environment and so on and so forth, it was not the case when it comes to the Precambrian organisms. And he says that there is no evident sign of this moment-to-moment engagement with the environment when it comes to these organisms. And therefore, the role played by the nervous system fits the second of the theories of nervous system that he was discussing in this paper, which is based on internal coordination rather than sensory motor control. Okay, and I don't want to go into all the details of these of the debate about the role and the evolution of the nervous system, but what is the takeaway for us here? So we have this distinction between internal coordination and engagement with the, or we should say, some environment, an environment. And the question is what this distinction means for our conception of boundaries. So let us refer to Koechlin Jr. again and one of the peers. The first peer he calls program. And by program, he writes, I mean an organized plan that describes both the ingredients themselves of the living system and the kinetics of the interactions among ingredients as the living system persists through time. And for the living systems we observe on Earth, this program is implemented by the DNA, of course. Now, to get a better grasp of what it means, we can compare a living system to some other complex entity, like let's say some Lego bricks construction. So the thing is that for one brick, it is irrelevant whether or not it is a part of a Lego bridge or house or car or whatever. It is irrelevant. And from the perspective of the Lego bridge, it is actually irrelevant whether or not the brick is made of plastic or something else. We can prefer plastic, but it's actually in principle irrelevant. Whereas when it comes to living creatures, it's not the case. From the most fundamental level up to the most complex level, you have one, as it were, well, at least according to Koechlin, program realized, which is responsible for the integrity of the whole system. So it is relevant for the most complex what is going on the most basic level, like the chemical level. So as I said, in the case of living system, there are different factors active at different levels of complexity, but what seems to make organisms unique is that all levels of complexity work in concert towards a single goal, the maintenance of the autonomy or the integrity of the system as a whole. So we can draw a distinction between two kinds of boundaries according to my proposal, namely, we have the principle or the program-based boundaries of a given complex system, not necessarily a living creature, any complex system, which means boundaries determined by the unifying principle or the unifying program of that complex system, whatever it is. And we have the free boundaries, which are not determined by any program. So we can say, if we like, that they are, let's say, purely conventional when it comes to our social interactions, for example. So this is one distinction we can draw. It's different from the bona fide versus fiat. It has actually nothing to do with the bona fide versus fiat distinction. It's from a different vocabulary, you might say. Now, how about interactions? If Godfrey Smith is right, interactions became an issue, so to speak, at some point in evolution. But once they did, they were quite crucial. And here is, let's say, not a proper characterization, but some sort of heuristic, if you like. If two structured entities, maintaining or not, but let's suppose maintaining some program-based boundaries, if they are supposed to interact, to couple, they need to negotiate where one of them ends and the other one begins, as it happens during peace negotiations, for example, between two countries. So there are certain interactive or interactional boundaries that they have to set up in order to set up certain conditions for their interactions. This is the main intuition here. And the political analogy works well, I would say. So this is not about the structures of these entities alone, as I put it here, but it is about negotiating a certain architecture of the realm of interactions. So this means that some complex entities need more than space. They need bounded spaces, and we can think of certain boundaries as factors specifying domains of possible interactions. And this applies to living creatures, I would say, as well. And the key word here is possible. If we are supposed to speak of possible scenarios of interactions between living creatures, this means that there must be some sort of stability, in not only when it comes to the very structure of the living system, but also there needs to be some sort of stability when it comes to the structure of interactions between living creatures and the living creatures on the one hand and their broad surroundings on the other. So where do these structures in the environment actually come from? They are, as I put it here, negotiated between, so to speak, of course, negotiated between different complex structures, as if striking many different deals, referring to where one entity ends and another entity begins. So metaphorically speaking, interactive boundaries are like stop signs indicating where the territory ruled by one entity ends and the territory of another entity begins. And this is not that much ad hoc a picture, because if we think of state borders, they may seem to have nothing to do with interactions. They are quite stable. But if we speak of spheres of influence, political influence, the influences between different sources of political and military powers, then these boundaries are much more interactive, or I would say, rather say, interactional. They are not that stable. And actually what we are facing right now on our beautiful continent is exactly that, the struggle between two powers, and one of them is not a European power. Actually, it's a struggle about the boundary between spheres of influence. And we can only hope that one side of this picture wins. At least this is my position. Okay, so, and in addition to the interactional boundary, we can also speak perhaps of some pre-given boundaries. Why not? Conceptually, it is still possible to have some pre-given boundaries, but they have to be distinguished from the interactional boundaries. And once again, this distinction has very little to do with the distinction between the bona fide versus fiat. It's a completely different vocabulary, and I dare to claim more useful than the fiat versus bona fide distinction. Okay, so this should be my final slide, although it is not, but I will make it my final slide.
You can have two more.
Okay, so we have many different combinations here. We have these pre-given boundaries, interactional boundaries, program-based boundaries, or free boundaries, and different combinations thereof. And so in the combination 1, we find the boundaries that things have only in virtue of their own structure and independently of their interactions, if any. Perhaps it's an empty category, but it is a thinkable category still. And in the combination referred here as 2, is an entity wrapped in boundaries that, on the one hand, are grounded in the nature of this thing, which means the principle responsible for that thing being exactly that thing, but on the other hand, they depend on interactions. There is no contradiction between these two statements, that something is determined by the principle and it is dependent also on interactions. And this is especially crucial when we speak of cognition. And this is something I would like to emphasize, although the workshop is not about cognition itself, but I would like to emphasize this part because, as I put it here, this is the key innovation introduced by Varela and the 4E movement, at least the part following Varela, in my ontological reading of Varela. Namely, as I put it here, this is an idea of cognition as a kind of world-making. Okay, fine, so it's constructivistic, if this is the right way to put it, or constructivist, okay. However, on the other hand, it's not just drawing boundaries from the top of your head. It's a constructive, or productive endeavor. I mean, cognition is a productive endeavor. We produce something in the world while we cognize. However, these products, so to speak, are determined by certain factors. They are not just from the top of our heads. They are not just from scratch. And we can think of cognition as something, as drawing these interactional yet program-based, in the sense of Koshland Jr., program-based boundaries. And we can think of the evolution of such boundary drawing. And the surfaces of our, let's say, everyday things are products of this evolution of what I call cognitive niche construction, but it's a different terminology I don't refer here to. So this is the key message when it comes to cognition. And just to go briefly, and I will conclude my presentation. So if we have this vocabulary, we can, as it is in formal ontology, as it is done in formal ontology usually, we can define many different concepts, like we can define a closed object, an open object, a partially closed object. We can define many different kinds of connection between objects and their boundaries and so on and so forth. And if we have these two distinctions between kinds of boundaries, interactional and non-interactional or pre-given, and program-based or free boundaries, we also have all these kinds of openness and closedness. And now we can ask, in what sense is a living system closed? In what sense it is open? And the key takeaway, at least when it comes to the nature of life, is that perhaps we can speak of, perhaps we can claim or defend the claim that organisms are by definition G-closed, as I put it here, which means that they have certain pre-given boundaries determined by their structure independently of any interactions. Fine. But still, we have a whole universe of interactional boundaries of organisms, and they are products of a very, very long and complex evolution. And now the message is that if you want to be more reductionist when it comes to life, then you should be able to reduce all the interactional boundaries and go down to these pre-given boundaries of organisms, which means boundaries that have absolutely nothing to do with the interactions. And now I would say it is a thinkable position, but good luck with that. I don't know to what extent it is actually doable. So from this perspective, given the fact that the interactional boundaries have impact on the evolution of these pre-given boundaries, the structural boundaries of organisms, so we have this feedback loop in the evolution of life, going back to the most primitive, purely structural boundaries, is thinkable a scenario, but not necessarily doable a research empirical project. So if you want to be a reductionist, go ahead and try. Thank you so much.
So the general idea is to not really have long Q&As immediately afterwards, because the discussions are intended for that. Maybe just one or two questions. Now I would just maybe have one question because we're over the time.
Sorry.
No, it's all, it happens. Okay, any question? Okay.
If no one else, like, it's just one question. So.
Just click on the button.
It's a really serious summit we have.
G20.
G20, yeah.
So first of all, thanks a lot. It was really exciting, quite intense, I would say. And I would have a lot of questions, but just keep it to one small one. I was just curious from the beginning on how you think about the notion of constraints relative to boundaries, because in our kind of studies, this is a quite frequently used term. Mm-hmm. And I think we understand it to some parts as a boundary. So I was surprised that you haven't used it just even once. So why is that, or is this not of importance, or how do you think about constraints?
But how would you define, I mean, just, for the sake of this question, how would you define constraints?
Well, this is his whole PhD project to do it, I think.
Maybe go for something like the delineation of a phase space, so you reduce the kind of degrees of freedom in a phase space.
Yeah, they should be, I would risk a statement that they should be regarded as interactional boundaries. And the only reason why I don't use the term is that, all the terms that we can use are embedded in some research projects. So that's why it's always risky to refer to use a term without any literature, so to speak. But this is the only reason. I mean, it's a practical reason, and I am very much open to the possibility of applications of my stuff in many different specific areas. And actually, this is the reason why I do the thing. I mean, I don't believe, well, it's once again a risky statement, but I do believe that at the end of the day, pure philosophy should be able to find ways to become applied philosophy. That's why usually I stay at the level of pure philosophy, but I'm very much not only open, but I'm actively seeking applications. So I would say that constraints are kinds of interactional boundaries. Mm-hmm. Just a provisional answer, of course.
Nice. I mean, it's also important maybe or exciting for you because constraints have this co-evolutive kind of cooperative function as well, as not just a boundary that is passively there, but as part of the organism, how he constrains its environment and its environment with him. So
Yeah.
constraints give a strength where you evolve to, and also kind of the boundary conditions. So, but I'm surprised, and now it's a bit more clear why it's not there. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
So maybe,
Thank you so much.